Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. Hello there. Today's webinar, Opportunities and Support for Trade and Investment in Southeast Asia. We're very happy to be joined by a stellar panel here today. I'll introduce them all in a moment, but just headline the fact that we've got Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner Natalie Black on board. Thank you very much for joining us. So today we're here together to review the effects of COVID-19 on the economy, the opportunities in ASEAN and the United Kingdom, and a little bit about who might recover first or recover at all. And it comes at a time of, I guess, a bit of a flurry of bad news. Singapore GDP forecast is in 5.8% dip in 2020. Unemployment, we found out in the last couple of days, the highest in a decade and expected to get even worse. We're in the worst recession in Singapore since independence. The UK even worse in some regards. An output drop of 8% predicted for the year, and talk now of 2023 before we return to pre-COVID levels. So nothing looking particularly good, unless of course you are celebrating in the way that many of us are the news that lockdown is easing, certainly here in Singapore. And perhaps it was some of that bad news that spurred the authorities into action, who knows. But we're also today going to hear about how the British Chambers of Commerce in the region are working with the respective governments to continue to boost trade and strengthen the growing network. So to the business of the day, and I'll begin by introducing some of the panel who I'm sure are well known to many of you. First, we have Simon Baptist, who's Chief Economist and Managing Director for Asia of the Economist Intelligence Unit. I mean, Simon oversees the research, the consultancy, the C-suite advisory services of the Economist Intelligence Unit in the region. And he's worth listening to. He has a doctorate in economics from and was a lecturer at Oxford University, along with degrees in economics and science from the University of Tasmania. He's frequently appearing on TV talking about these things. His insight is very valued, so we're lucky to have him here today, but don't expect too much good news. Next we have Natalie Black, who, as I mentioned, is Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Asia Pacific at the Department for International Trade. She covers Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australasia. Previously, Natalie was the Deputy Head of the No. 10 Policy Unit, where she championed the UK's tech sector and developed the new modern industrial strategy. And in addition to this role, she held the post of Director of the Internet Harms Unit, coordinating efforts to tackle the challenges of terrorist use and online safety of the Internet. So good to have you with us, Natalie. And then, of course, there's David Kelly, Executive Director of the British Chamber of Commerce, responsible for strategy, growth, and profile of the Chamber, and always looking for opportunities to support businesses and connect opportunities between the UK and across ASEAN. And David himself worked at the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, where he spearheaded the development and execution of a reinvigorated global marketing strategy. So we've got some good brains around the table today. And we've also got all of you, our participants, and we would like you to participate. Please feel free to look for the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We're going to hear from the speakers first. They have a few remarks to kick us off. And then for the last 20 minutes or so of the session, we'll gradually work through those questions. But to begin, if I can hand over to Simon, who's going to kick off the session for us this afternoon with something of an overview. Over to you, Simon.
Great, thanks Mark, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So I'm going to share what we at the Economist Intelligence Unit are expecting to see happen to the regional and global economy over the next couple of years, as Mark highlighted. I mean, there's not a whole lot of good news, although I think we're all well aware that the current situation isn't great. So what I'm trying to focus on is what are the implications of what is going on, what's going to be the pathway from here, so from where we are now, what do we think is going to happen over the next 12, 24, 36 months, what will be the pace of recovery, how will it differ by country, and then I'll touch a bit on how things like FDI and trade are going to be affected as well. So just to begin, I mean, this is our forecast for the global economy for 2020. The red countries are growing faster and the blue countries are growing slower, although this year it's more about blue countries are shrinking by the most and the red countries are shrinking by less. There's just really a handful of countries that are still expected to see positive growth this year. I mean, really amongst major economies, it's only China, Indonesia, and some other small ones in Asia like Bangladesh, Myanmar, and then a couple of African countries like Tanzania that we are expecting to have positive growth this year. Now, in the case of a place like Indonesia or Tanzania, the reason why they're expected to have positive growth is largely because they haven't taken controlling the virus very seriously. And so they haven't had any economic shutdown. In the case of China, I mean, they're just going to eke out growth, probably even less than 1%, which, given they're used to growing by 6 or 7, is a huge slowdown. Europe and Latin America are going to be the worst affected regions, and we can expect this to cause some geopolitical changes, so that rise of East Asia and the decline of Europe in a political sense is definitely going to continue and is being reinforced by the response and the outcomes to COVID. The US global leadership, of course, has also been very highly damaged throughout the course of this pandemic, and existing tensions, for example, within the EU between the North and the South have also been exacerbated as growth in the North, a place like Germany, particularly is going to be a lot stronger, I mean, Germany or France, than in, say, Italy, Spain, Portugal, or Greece. When we have a look at Southeast Asia, the countries in blue are the ones that are facing the largest slowdown, so that's Singapore, and also Thailand are the two economies that we're thinking are going to be the hardest hit. Having a look at what is happening country by country, I put up some major European and North American economies here in this chart, along with China for comparison. It's really important to, I think, not focus too much on growth rates. We're going to hear a lot of data over the next 12 months announcing GDP or other sorts of growth rates. They're going to be really hard to interpret because of the wild swings that we've seen. Things are going to change massively quarter by quarter and year on year. So I think what you need to do is look at levels. And the question we're focusing on is, when do we get back to Q4 2019 is sort of the big economic question. If you have a look at the chart I've got up there, you'll see Q4 2019 is 100, so it's rebased so that period is 100. We actually expect China to get back to where it was in Q4 before the end of 2020, and that's one of the fastest recoveries of any country. For the US and the big economies in Europe, we're not expecting a return until the latter half of 2022. So the growth rate's going to look good in terms of over the next quarter as we rebound up from this very deep recession, but don't interpret that as necessarily a good news story. But when you're thinking about who's going to do well and who's going to do badly, I would caution to forget a lot of the talk about lockdowns and forget a lot of the talk about ventilators and ICU beds and infection rates and all this kind of stuff. Those factors are not going to determine countries' long-term economic performance. They will affect the short term, but not the long term. Looking further out, it's the usual factors. Who's got fiscal space and the commitment to use it? Who's got monetary policy flexibility? What is the sectoral composition of the country? Are the industries compatible with distancing? Is there pent-up demand, or is demand just being lost? What's the export market exposure, demographics, aging, and what's been done in the lockdown time. You see in this chart, I expect the UK to have one of the deeper recessions in Europe, but it's also going to have one of the faster recoveries. And this is because the UK, not being part of the euro, has got control over its own currency. It's got more fiscal space and a willingness to use it. So the government has gone strongly into deficit. And it's also got more policy flexibility, particularly with, sort of official Brexit having already happened and real Brexit coming up probably on the 31st of December. The UK will have more policy flexibility than the rest of Europe. Trade is going to shrink by about 25% this year. We already had the trade war that we talked a lot about last year. These existing protectionist trends are going to be exacerbated by this. Actually, I do expect to see a resumption in US-China trade tensions over the next few months. China's not going to meet the purchase commitments that it agreed to in January because of the COVID situation. It's not going to buy as much from the US as it said it would. And given Trump's struggles, I think he'll take the opportunity to pick a fight against China in his election campaign. He's on the lookout for any kind of distraction that puts the debate onto issues where he's strong. And one issue where he is strong is on confronting China. For people involved in trade, you'll know trade financing has gotten more expensive and cargo capacity has come down. So that's the impact of the decline of passenger aircraft, of course, which has had a big impact on air freight availability. We had a big supply shock from China earlier in the piece, and then of course it reverberated around the rest of the world, hitting Europe and North America. There's still scope for further supply shocks, I think particularly Latin America, which is now the global epicenter of infections, Africa, and some countries in Asia like Indonesia and like India that have not had a very good crisis response, could be at risk there. After 2009, China saved the world with its imports. China did a huge stimulus, imported everything from the rest of the world. Commodity prices went up. Everybody's export demand was really, really strong because of that. But China is not going to save the world this time. The latest import data is very weak. China is very focused on its domestic economy at the moment. In fact, the policy weakness in China is really obvious. What moves did they make last week? They liberalized the rules on roadside stalls. Now, that is not going to change China's economy. It is not going to make a big dent in unemployment or growth. And the fact that they are having to resort to policies in the informal trading sector kind of shows how much of a struggle it's going to be for them. And so they're going to keep their stimulus to themselves. Supply chains are stressed, but I think we need to be careful about our predictions of how fast we think they might change and how permanently that might be. Supply chains have evolved and become very international because it's really worthwhile doing, because it's cost effective, you can access more products, and it gives people more employment and better consumption opportunities. So that process I don't think is going to unwind, but I do think the balance when people are making their judgments about exactly what to put where between resilience and efficiency, it's going to shift a little bit in favour of resiliency. But it's quite hard to move a lot of supply chains. I've put some data up here for that pie chart at the bottom right is the market share of people who are making front-end semiconductors. And 3 US companies have about 75% of the global production. A Japanese company has effectively all of the rest. And so if you're in electronics, it's actually virtually impossible to diversify your supply chain away from the US and certainly from the US plus Japan, even as much as geopolitics or resilience might suggest that you would like to. I mean, the tech supply chains are very complex. Specialization can't easily be unwound. Capital labor ratios vary substantially at different stages in the supply chain, and that's exactly why it's made sense for those supply chains to be spread across countries. A few things have been accelerated though by this crisis. One is a huge hole blown in India's plans to be a manufacturing hub. The fact that you couldn't even get a laptop delivered to your staff who were trying to work remotely during COVID has certainly meant no company is going to be relying on India for its supply chains anytime soon. And just finally finishing up, what's happening with FDI. Of course, the big foreign investors have been hit hard by the crisis, Europe, China and the US. There will be a lot of merger and acquisition opportunities, I think, particularly in countries that have been hard hit and that have weak fiscal positions or weak ability to respond. So in this region, countries that have been hard hit like Thailand, we might find there are some bargains going. On the other hand, everything is now strategic. Nationalism has been increased through this crisis. It's already a trend that was with us. But in times of crisis, people turn to the national government. They turn to their flag, by and large, and they turn against foreigners. We've seen this in some of the questionable benefit of restrictions that have been introduced. And for a lot of us on this call, we might be thinking about the new UK quarantine measures, which of course are completely useless at this point, but it's just kind of a political move on the part of the UK government. And the UK is by far from the only government that has done that. I mean, Singapore, of course, has been flexing its nationalistic muscle as well. We've all be aware of the difficulties that, say, EP holders have had in coming back here, and those of us who are not Singaporeans, certainly, like, we have felt the additional restrictions that have been imposed on us in terms of travel and movement throughout this process. So everything is now strategic, all sorts of industries, not just military, even foodstuffs and of course medical equipment as well. For companies that have got cash, and Japan really stands out here, there could be opportunities, but my personal take is valuations are very, very high. Warren Buffett's also thinking valuations are a bit high at the moment, and particularly with the stock market moves over the last couple of weeks. Actually, personally, I find it quite difficult to see prices going up from here, which will, so it'll have to be case by case finding a bargain. And on this chart, we've shown the different countries in Southeast Asia. Green is where there's a free trade stance, yellow, a mild protectionist stance, and then red is where there is a strong protectionist stance. So Singapore still, compared to the rest of the region, a lot more open than everywhere else. Some countries have certainly tightened up in this period. So Australia has introduced a lot of additional restrictions, particularly on Chinese investment, even though it still remains committed to free trade. And there's been a lot of new export restrictions introduced. So over the next while, I think we can expect to see some difficulties in trade and FDI from the nationalist perspective as well. So worth considering what sectors you're in and maybe what you can do to ameliorate those concerns. I'll finish up there.
Thank you very much, Simon. There's some incredible insights there, great overview. And I think we're all wrestling with this. I'll just feed in where I come from. At Klareco Communications, where I'm the managing director, we've been helping companies navigate all of this uncertainty and this change. And we keep hearing repeated concerns, which is, you know, when things are so uncertain, when you know so little about how your business environment, your international network is going to unfold, how you can possibly maintain the trust and the loyalty of your customers, of your staff, of your stakeholders, of your investors. And I think, just to follow on, you saying everything has become strategic right down to food, I think everything has become strategic right down to the most simple communication at the moment, as everyone tries to navigate through this. And I think that's probably a good way of bringing us on to Natalie, because what everyone is trying to work out here is just how do we get through this? Yeah, how impacted is everything, and how can countries work together? And I think everyone will be very interested, Natalie, in what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you to the British Chamber for putting this event together. It's of course incredibly timely. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer all the questions around what are we going to do about it. So I just want to do a bit of expectations management there. And I'm always wary of following Simon, because if you think he's downbeat, wait until you hear what I've got to say. But in all seriousness, look, it is an incredibly tough time. And what I was hoping to do in this session is talk through a little bit in terms of what I'm seeing around UK, ASEAN trade, some of the specific sector impacts, which Simon's touched on as well, but most importantly, how we can work together going forward. And I am more optimistic in those areas. I think it's easy to forget where we were 4 months ago. So January 2020, February 2020, we had the Foreign Secretary doing his very first post-Brexit visit to this part of the world. And we were hugely upbeat about the opportunities here. Obviously, the numbers tell the story in terms of the potential of fourth largest economy by 2030 for ASEAN, over 600 million people as a potential market, combined GDP of $2 trillion. So personally, I think the fundamentals are still very strong. There's a lot going for the ASEAN market. I mean, one indicator to point to, I think, is the age of the population across ASEAN. So it's around 90% are under 25, and people can have arguments to the extent to which that's also helped manage some of the impact of COVID. But those fundamentals remain true in terms of this is a young, dynamic part of the world with lots of growth potential. But of course, what's happened in the last few months is significant and will have a lasting effect, which I think is really what Simon was getting to in terms of there's a lot of discussion about the recovery by the end of the year, but we know that this is with us for some time to come. The UK has been committed in this part of the world, of course, for a very, very long time. But last year was our highest investment in ASEAN for the last 10 years. So we've seen a really good trajectory, and I very much hope that will continue. In terms of what we've seen during COVID, I mean, I think what's remarkable is the extent to which goods between the UK and ASEAN writ large have continued to flow. That's been pretty impressive, actually, considering how significant the challenges were. We all know the issues around people-to-people movement, and that's significant for the region anyway because of the way it's structured, you know, the reliance on remittances, the joined-up nature of the economy. You know, if we were talking about this at the beginning of January, we would be saying ASEAN isn't joined up enough. But of course, what we're living through at the moment is the extent that it is joined up, and that's really very important. The areas that do concern me in terms of the challenges to the fundamentals is particularly around investment. So the UK is the second largest investor in ASEAN. From the European perspective, I very much hope that that continues. But if anyone's seen the UNCTAD report this morning, you know, that's predicting a 40% drop in global investment this year. And for that to continue by additional 5 to 10% next year. So that sort of goes back to my point that we are in for the long haul here and therefore have to plan accordingly. I mean, I'm sure that David will talk a little bit about this from the point of view of the Chamber, but what it means by what I'm sort of seeing from British companies and ASEAN partners is that, of course, we are seeing companies slow down their expansion plans. That might be a case of investments not coming through in the way that they hoped. They can't get their new head of office to the right place in the region, et cetera, et cetera. But the flip side is that we are seeing a lot of interest in new technologies in particular. That technology debate is only becoming more and more important in the context of COVID-19. And then a lot of interest in distressed assets, always the issue in a recession, and everyone will have views on whether that is a good or a bad thing. And then the issue of supply chains, which again, Simon's touched on, and I see that Sam Molson's on the webinar, and I know they're doing a lot of work on this issue at the moment. But there will be a very long discussion around this tension, which Simon alluded to, in terms of resilience versus efficiency. And I really do think that that will play out in this part of the world. So that's sort of my take on how UK and ASEAN trade is impacted at a very high level. But moving to sort of sector specific impact, I mean, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, right? In terms of course, the extensive impact we're seeing on tourism, travel, anything to do with the garment industry. The travel and tourism sector is obviously fundamental to ASEAN. You know, it employs 40 million workers across the region. It's 20% of GDP in Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines. But at the same time, you look to what's happening in Thailand and people are adapting and evolving. So again, I think there are sort of reasons to be cheerful in terms of how even those sectors which are perhaps most challenged will rebound. Again, I'm seeing a lot of interest in the energy sector. Those challenges, and probably it was the biggest theme pre-COVID-19 that we were all talking about in terms of this part of the world, how was it going to adapt and evolve, watching the forest fires in Australia, for example, big debate in coal in Japan. And again, I know the Chamber's doing a lot of work on this through Tim Rockall, but I don't think the energy debate is going to go away, but the question is going to be the extent to which it becomes a nice to have versus a fundamental part of the strategy for economic recovery of any government. And again, lots of people will have different views, but you can guess which side of the argument I would be on. And The other sector, of course, that will get a lot of interest, which I've already mentioned, is technology. So life sciences and medtech, again, seen as really important vehicles to getting through COVID-19. Huge amount of interest in startups in this area, lots of queries from investors. I think the challenge is particularly for the scale-ups. So maybe those who are on the path to IPOing and making sure that they can continue those investment relationships, that's quite tricky. So in a UK context, the Chancellor announced the Future Fund, which was in particular to protect these firms who were in for quite a bumpy time, because all of their focus has been on growth, because that is what is valued at the moment. But going forward, they're going to need to protect their assets. And so that's what the Future Fund is very much there to do. I'm really happy to talk about any elements of that. In terms of other areas that I think we should be excited about, fintech, again, seen as part of the solution to COVID-19. It was already doing really, really well in Southeast Asia, but again, that just seems to be going from strength to strength. And then I'm sure all of us are contributing to the e-commerce boom, given the inability to shop elsewhere. But I mean, some of the numbers are really staggering. I was looking through these again this morning. You know, e-commerce in Malaysia has gone up 149%. Now, anyone who's tried to buy anything in Malaysia through e-commerce knows that it's not the most smooth process. So that shows, I think, a new level of commitment and engagement, and probably likely to stay. I mean, the quiet horse in all of this, I think, is Vietnam, which has a really strong tech sector anyway. And given how well they've responded to COVID-19, they will be able to leapfrog, I think, maybe some of the more traditional star players. So I think that's really exciting. The area that I'm not sure about, in all honesty, and would be interesting to hear different views, is infrastructure. You know, that really was one of our big bets from the point of the view of how we were backing British companies in this part of the world through UK export finance, really developing government-to-government relationships. And the question, of course, is going to be the extent to which governments now see infrastructure as retaining that position, as contributing to the return to growth and stability, or being a cost which they just can't afford because they want to focus on public health and employment support, and see the two areas as different rather than complementary. I mean, we've seen announcements out of some governments. So Thailand's announced 93 new infrastructure projects. But on the flip side, President Jokowi's been relatively quiet in terms of plans in Indonesia, which of course wasn't how it felt pre-COVID-19. So that would be my sort of run through on where I think we are on sectors, but really keen to take that up in more depth in the discussion. And lastly, I'd just like to focus on how I hope UK and ASEAN can collaborate going forward, particularly on supporting each other's recovery, and of course, protecting the overall global trading position. It is not unanimous that free trade is going to be the way to get us out of this mess, but what we are doing is trying to build that coalition of voices. The Secretary of State for the Department for International Trade has spent a lot of time on the phone recently, particularly with leaders in this part of the world, because through the ASEAN bloc or Indonesia through the G20, you know, there's a lot of influence here that can make a real global difference. In practice, that means things like getting our continuity agreements with Singapore and Vietnam across the line before we hit the deadline at the end of the year. We have ongoing trade dialogues with Indonesia and Thailand. And I think what's really impressive is the extent to which all of us have adapted to technology in these times in terms of just moving those meetings online. Again, a year ago, if one of us had proposed that we're going to do all of these conversations virtually, I can imagine what the response would have been. But to use that terrible phrase, the new normal, that is what is accepted now, and I very much hope that will be the way going forward. I also hope that you spotted that the UK has submitted its application for dialogue partner status to ASEAN. We did that a couple of weeks ago, really setting out in stone our commitment to this part of the world. And of course, we've opened our embassy in Jakarta, and our ambassador there, John Lamb, is leading the charge. So we're really committed in the way that what we've tried to do is, even amongst this crisis and everything else going on, we want to remain committed to our strategy here. And a big part of that is trade. And again, I hope you would have noticed that last week at London Tech Week, we announced the UK's first digital trade network, and we are piloting that first here in Asia Pacific. And that includes a particular focus in ASEAN, including Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. And following on from that, I hope we will be saying something on CPTPP very soon. And while I take breath, that's also since we've launched negotiations with the US, Japan last week, and we'll be saying something very soon on Australia and New Zealand. So we are definitely ambitious for this part of the world in terms of how we hope our relationships can develop. But sort of going back to Simon's graphs, realistic about what it's going to be like for the coming years. And I think getting that balance right is going to be absolutely essential, and ensuring that we have the right support for business in place to do that through organisations like the Chamber. But thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Natalie. I mean, a great addition there, and I mean, I think heartening for all of us on this call to hear the commitment from the Department for International Trade to help see through these challenges. But you quite rightly ended there by talking about the other support that might be available to businesses. And you know, I know myself, I'm a business owner, and these are not the most enjoyable times. But I think anyone who's in a management position or who has a network across ASEAN or Asia is facing a huge amount of difficulty, either you know, in cash flow issues, in people movement issues. And I think knowing that you've got somewhere you can turn to ask questions and hopefully leverage some support is always very comforting. So that brings us on to you, David. I think being a member of the British Chamber, we're always looking for what you can do for us. And I know you've been doing a good bit of thinking and a lot of outreach and initiatives like these to help support people. It'd be great for all of us here, I think, to hear the very latest. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and very much, Mark, and thank you, Simon and Natalie, as well, for your support on this call. It really has been an extraordinary time, right? And I think what's been very interesting from our perspective within the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore is almost been that focal point for companies to come to us with some of their challenges, but also some of their solutions, which has been really interesting in playing that back. You know, Natalie did say that, you know, it is a tough time and that working together going forwards is really important. And I think one of the things that this time during COVID has taken, and I might put a slightly glossier, happier sort of view on all of this, is that it really has kicked us into a digital space, and it has made us think really long and hard about what the British Chamber of Commerce network, not just here in Singapore, but more broadly, can do to support. So for those that are listening outside of Singapore, you'll be really pleased to know that myself and my colleagues across the region have had a much better engagement with the British Chamber of Commerce network in the UK. There's been a very frequent dialogue around supporting the opportunities for trade across different regions and sharing best practice across that chamber network. And I think one of the things that's really highlighted is that there's a massive network, a really big infrastructure on the other side of the world, as Natalie has mentioned, around ASEAN being such an important market, that there are people in market to provide some support. So this is a perfect session, because this has almost wrapped up one of our initiatives, which was an online podcast series with all of the chambers in the Britain in Southeast Asia network, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. For us to just open a dialogue and start creating a communication channel back to companies in the UK and back to companies in the region as well that are looking at the broader ASEAN market to go and expand to really think about some of the opportunities, where they might be, some of the key sectors to focus on, really understanding some of the experience. And whilst that helicopter view over 20 to 30 minutes is only a very small snapshot of different sectors, we hope that that provides a good narrative going forwards. So it's really been a time of sort of pivoting for us as a chamber, really looking at how we can provide that support mechanism. And with trade service activity being a big part of what we do, supporting UK companies to come across to Singapore, Singapore being the second easiest place in the world to do business, using Singapore as a launchpad, a lily pad to access the rest of the ASEAN region, we felt it was very important as a chamber to ensure that we were thinking a bit differently and providing that opportunity whilst people might be at home and unable to get to the office and looking at other markets while they can't physically travel. So one of the things that's going on at the moment is we're running a virtual trade mission in the food and drink sector where we've had some success pairing brands from the UK to the market here in Singapore. And it just goes to show that there are opportunities there, and that the Chamber Network can provide that support mechanism for organisations. We have gone through an element of navigating a lot of uncertainty, and maintaining that trust and loyalty that was highlighted before on this call has been really important. And I think one of the key things that we've been doing as a chamber and as a member, Mark, I hope you've seen this, is we've been trying to have a much more engaged conversation with the Singapore government. We've been trying to have a much stronger narrative around what the challenges of British businesses have been, how we can help them, and to really make sure that the voice of British business here in Singapore more specifically has had that we've had the opportunity to present challenges and views back. And we've just done another pulse check survey of our members, and even though we're seeing that the point where a lot of small businesses are struggling with cash flow, those that are, there is some support from the government in terms of from the various resilience and solidarity packages, etc., to support businesses, but 92% of our members still have a huge amount of confidence in Singapore as a business hub, and I think that is a very positive statement in terms of there is support here and there is an opportunity here. There are some negatives around that. There is a lot of our members have said that they've had a significant economic impact, and I think one of the things that we're trying to do is really ensure that we're using this time to make sure that we're able to connect businesses in different ways. We're helping with customer acquisition in a slightly different way. If you can't have face-to-face meetings, what are the other opportunities available? So ASEAN, from our recent Pulse Check survey, is still a huge priority for our members more specifically here in Singapore. 97% of them see the opportunity across ASEAN. And I think that absolutely sort of pushed the chamber in a position to start thinking about how do we start working more collaboratively with the other chamber networks. So one of the things that we had, and as I mentioned, was that podcast series. But I think more broadly, what I've been really pleased with, and I think what my colleagues in the region have been really pleased with, is that we're starting to have a much more engaged dialogue around how we support companies. And we've started to see companies come to us from other chambers where they've been looking at Singapore, and vice versa. We've been pushing other companies and hand-holding them to other markets where they've got that support network. So that is, I think, been really sort of positive, and I think that will only continue to happen going forwards. Myself, I've been in Singapore about 5 years, and the first thing that I did was when I stepped foot out of the M25 from HQ in London, when they said, Asia's got all the opportunity, go and see if you can grow the business. My first port of call was the Chamber of Commerce. And one of the things that the Chamber helped me to do was to really navigate where my potential customers might be. And one of the things that really came out of the podcast series was that valuable insight that members can get from that network to help fast track the opportunity to start meeting new customers in market with people that have got the expertise on the ground, and connect you to other members that have been through a very, very similar journey. So I'll end on the fact that there's a really strong network there. And I think one of the things that we need to do as a chamber network is have that consistent and strong dialogue back to the UK to tell UK companies that there is a market here. These are some of the opportunities. These are some of the problem statements, and we've got the solutions in the UK to support that market as well.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So, we've heard from three very important perspectives there. I think it's time to ask a few more targeted questions, and we have got some questions that are coming in already through the Q&A chat. We'll just give you a few moments, attendees, to fire in a few more. But I think just listening to all of those presentations, there are a couple of themes that are very strong. One of them is, I think, where you were just now, David, on collaboration. The other one, connectivity, and we're seeing some questions around that. So I think I might start there. We mentioned earlier the UK's quarantine measures, which Simon has some views on and which he shared, but they're not the only ones, as we know. travel is extremely hard. There's a lot of talk and optimism about green lanes and air bridges. It would be very interesting to hear people's perspectives, I think, on two tracks. One is, what is the prognosis for a UK-Singapore air bridge sometime soon, if we can get some perspective on that. And the second would be how important getting some form of green lane travel network in ASEAN will be to help to fuel the recovery. So, I mean, I think it's unfair, but probably only fair to ask you first, Natalie, on what you think of the chances of a UK-Singapore air bridge, which was a question kindly fired in by Tim Rockall.
Thanks, Mark. And I probably shouldn't let it go without pointing out that Simon's line on our 14-day quarantine policy is not the official government response. I mean, you know, look, I don't suggest we get into a big debate on this, but where we are in the UK is the domestic transmission rate has gone down now. So that's why we do have to turn our attention to imported transmission, exactly the same way that countries, particularly in this part of the world, and we've been watching their experiences carefully. So it's not an easy policy to implement, and will be reviewed every 3 weeks or so as part of our overall review of measures. But we do think it's an important step to take to manage the domestic transmission element. In terms of the air bridge question, and thanks very much for that, Tim, you know, again, we're watching really closely what's happening in this part of the world. You know, we are very lucky to be here because it's likely that there will be more air bridges that appear here, probably compared to anywhere else in the world, if you follow the discussions with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, etc. I'm afraid I think it will take some time around the UK and Singapore for a whole range of reasons, but that is something that we need to consider and take our time to look at properly. I think a really pressing issue, and one that I think the Chamber's done amazing work on, is trying to address this problem around British passport holders whose family is based in Singapore, who are currently split up. And both the High Commissioner here in Singapore and David's been doing a lot of work around that to try and make sure that families can be reunited. But David, I don't know if you want to add anything on that point.
No, I guess it's obviously very, very important to sort of get people back, and we've seen some companies that have been suffering through having you know, C suites and C-1 level outside of the country, you know, with a necessity to support their business activities here and in the region. So, you know, as Natalie said, you know, we're trying to do as much as we can to provide a consistent narrative with cases where we possibly can, just to provide that additional support mechanism for those that are outside, for either humanitarian reasons with their families being a part, or for those key people and organisations to try and help them to come back.
Thanks, David. We might come back onto people movement again in a little bit, but first, I mean, Simon, it would be interesting to hear your views economically on just how important it is to get these air bridges or travel arrangements sorted out in ASEAN. And there's another question here that's come in, just noting the arrangement with Malaysia and how potentially important that could be to Singapore, and what the prospects are there.
I think, unfortunately, travel is going to be very, very slow to come back. So, yeah, as Natalie said, I'm talking as the Economist, not as the Chamber or as the UK government. I've got no idea about no insight into the behind the closed doors discussions. But from my perspective, UK-Singapore will be a long, long way off. I mean, the UK infection rate is so high compared to here. It's you know, it's got one of the worst outbreaks. And so Singapore is going to open up last to the countries with the worst outbreak. So I wouldn't be holding out any hope of that, probably till next year. First, we've already got the existing lane with China, but it's pretty annoying to use. Next, I think will probably be, you know, next off the rank will be New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea. But the challenge that Singapore's got is actually getting the other countries to accept Singapore, right? So the challenge with the UK is Singapore accepting the UK. The challenge with Singapore and the other countries in APAC is those countries accepting Singapore, given the outbreak here has been so much worse. And the trust issue plays into the Malaysia angle as well. Malaysia's outbreak looks small on the official data. It looks under control. Do you really believe it? I don't. You know, I think they're doing better than Indonesia, but I can't quite believe the official data from Malaysia, and I suspect that Singapore officials don't quite believe it either. Now, I think we're going to need some movement across the causeway, maybe for people who can, you know, sort of get tested and get pre-approved to come over for day-to-day work. But unfortunately, travel, I think, is a long, long way off for anything but you know, VIPs or politicians kind of going, or perhaps the odd CEO. But
thanks, Simon. And I think just to come back to that idea of people movement, David, you mentioned there the dislocated C-suite, family members that have occurred. There are also businesses, as I think was highlighted earlier, who are struggling to move people either to Singapore, from Singapore, around the region. We've obviously discussed that tech and expectations around physical meetings can mitigate that somewhat. But it would be very interesting to hear some perspectives, and perhaps first from you, David, on where people can turn, where businesses can turn if they're really struggling to get people in. I mean, I know one thing that would be on the mind at the moment is this is the season in the entire international schooling network, for example, where the teachers kind of change shift. And probably in Singapore, we're expecting upwards of 100 or perhaps even several hundred teacher movements to occur. So these are very real concerns for businesses. And I guess many people would like to know if there are avenues that could be suggested that they could open up for assistance.
The education space is very specific here in Singapore, so I won't necessarily touch on that element. But you're right. You're absolutely right. We're working with a company in the blockchain space in the UK who were getting very close to exporting their solution here to Singapore before COVID. And one of the things that we advised that organisation on as they were working with our trade services team was to maintain that relationship, because even you can still maintain relationships in a digital environment and providing that support. And what that led to was, 6 weeks ago, them having an online conversation with their stakeholders, ensuring that their brand and their product solution was still available. And because those companies also had access to go and talk to each other. So my advice from a trade perspective, if we're struggling to actually do business face-to-face, is that it does present opportunities for a digital networking environment, an opportunity for business groups and such as the chambers to be able to connect you with the right people to have a conversation and start a dialogue. One of the bits of advice we learned quite quickly was that interaction and that engagement isn't the same as being in person. So being very succinct and going in there with a solution to a problem is much better naturally. But that's an element of advice that we can provide and support certainly as a chamber network.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And I'm just going to turn to some of the other questions that are coming in from those who've joined the webinar. Reuter Tra came in pretty quickly with this question, so it must be a fairly burning one. How much of an increase are we expecting in M&A activities across ASEAN? I know we said we would see some, but what sort of level? And what would be the main areas that we might see? And I think naturally, Simon, that might come to you first.
I think M&A globally will probably see some, I'd say, opportunities rather than a boom, because of course financing is hard to come by and people are quite risk averse. But there's certainly there are going to be bottom fishers out there looking where there are good valuations. In Southeast Asia, the challenge is that is nationalism actually, because in Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, which are the three countries with the biggest fiscal capacity, those governments, Malaysia and Thailand are already relatively skeptical of M&A of key assets. Now, Singapore in a sense is a lot more open, but still everything that matters is controlled by Temasek or GIC ultimately. Those countries are much more likely to use public funds to bail out struggling companies if they're important ones, like say Thai Airways in the case of Thailand, rather than leaving that to the private sector. But I mean, there could be some in less strategic industries. I'd normally say there might be some, but as we discussed, There's not much that isn't strategic these days. And then Indonesia, there could be some good opportunities because the economy is going to really struggle there, and they don't have the domestic financing capacity. But they do have, again, a famously nationalistic stance towards foreign investors. So I think in Southeast Asia, the opportunities are going to be limited by some of those fiscal and political factors.
And the protectionist word has come up quite a lot. Obviously, it can manifest itself in many ways. We've got another question here about access for British professionals to move to Singapore during the COVID recovery time. What might we expect to see as sort of limitations in international movement of business people and the opportunity to place professionals in different markets, Singapore included? I think that's going to be a very interesting one to get some perspective on. Perhaps, Natalie, if I can come to you first on that.
Yeah, sure, Mark. I mean, I do think this is a really interesting question for Singapore, because obviously it's positioned itself as a regional hub. And a key part of that is enabling business people to travel around the region. So I do know that sort of front and center of their minds in terms of their economic response. And we have had some good and promising noises around the priority of business travel. So I am optimistic there, but as ever, if any of the Chamber's members have specific examples where they are in difficulties for whatever reason, then do get in touch with me or get in touch with David, because we are talking to MTI and others pretty much every day now in one format or another, or indeed EDB, but having specific cases to highlight makes all the difference. I think the flip side of that is I sort of hear two different points of view from the business community. One is how important is business travel going to be going forward? You know, everything that we've been talking about, adoption of technology. And I think where I've come to on this event eventually is, yes, we're very lucky that we've been able to roll out technology so quickly to maintain relationships and contacts. But actually, it really doesn't make up for those new relationships and those new engagement. And so for a lot of us, say if you're working on investment opportunities, for example, you're living off at the moment work that you started 6, 12, 18 months ago. And so what I'm worried about is actually what's going to happen in 6, 12, 18 months in the future in terms of developing that pipeline. And then the other side of that is a lot of British companies might only have one base for their operations for the whole of ASEAN or for the whole of Asia Pacific. And of course, one of the lessons that they're interpreting from this is that the resilient operating model? And do you at least have to have a couple so that you can flex depending on circumstances?
Thanks, Natalie. And just while I have you, because this is a question in Paulie and Giovanni's mind, how imminent do we think is that UK-Singapore free trade agreement? What we hope are the components of that around recognition of qualifications between Singapore and UK and vice versa that would help with a sort of free flow of talent?
Pauline, I'm sorry, I'm going to be incredibly boring, but I promise you it's for the greater good. You won't be surprised that because this is a live negotiation, I'm not going to be able to say anything about the content or our aspirations. Only that, you know, Singapore is an absolutely key partner, and my whole pitch here has been the demonstration around how important this part of the world is. But we need to be tough negotiators on both sides of the fence.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. And I'm not sure if that means you can comment on this one at all either, but Chris Nelson was just inquiring whether there are any ongoing trade discussions with the Philippines that you can share anything on.
Hi, Chris. Really good to hear from you. I hope all is well there. So we have an annual financial dialogue in the Philippines, which includes market access discussions and elements of our trade relationship. Because of COVID-19, we had to rearrange the timing of that, but I hope that we will be able to get it back in the diary very soon.
Thanks, Natalie. And I mean, let's just move on to sustainability for a moment, because there are a couple of questions around that theme. I think, you know, I could sort of put them together in a way. One question on people's mind is everything we're going through what the effect might be in this part of the world on the movement towards sustainability. Will it help it move forward, or will it disincentivize it because of cheap oil? And also whether there's a great opportunity for the UK to play with its expertise in wind or decarbonisation or other areas in helping ASEAN achieve sustainability goals within this time. So Simon, it would be good to hear any thoughts you might have on that macro point of where we see that going in this period.
Yeah. I mean, the low oil price is pretty independent of renewables demand and prospects for renewables these days. I mean, oil and renewables don't compete a lot. Renewables are basically in electricity generation, and oil has a very small role in electricity generation these days. Now, of course, the price of coal and natural gas has also come down. Now we're expecting US oil output to shrink quite significantly. The OPEC production cuts still, although they're holding that together for the moment. So I expect oil by the end of the year to be at around $50 a barrel through the last quarter, and probably around there for next year as well. So I think we'll get back to status quo in terms of the kind of the relative price differential. Southeast Asia, as far as climate change goes, it's a lot of talk and not much action. Singapore still caucuses as a small island developing state, sitting alongside Tonga and, Caribbean islands, claiming that it shouldn't have to do anything. So, yes, I saw one of the questions said they updated their nationally determined action plans. I mean, it's just disgustingly weak for a country as rich as Singapore, frankly. I know that's my or the Economist kind of position on it. The rest of the region doesn't really have much policy chops in terms of their commitment to renewables. Again, it's a lot of talk and not a lot of real commitment. The exception is Vietnam, where they did do that big feed-in tariff policy last year that led to massive amounts of investment in the solar sector. That is a real success story. Shows it could be replicated. I was expecting maybe other countries to pick up on that. But climate is just not going to be a government priority, I think, is the sad reality for the next 12 months, despite the short-term respite for the climate through this period.
Thanks. But I guess on the second part of that question, Natalie, with what the UK has to offer in terms of expertise in this area, will it be an area of key focus?
Thanks, Mark. It certainly will, particularly offshore wind. We have a really strong partnership in Taiwan and South Korea, and we're seeing more and more interest from companies operating there coming down to Southeast Asia. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. But at the same time, I'm afraid I think what Simon says does ring true. We're going to have to see if governments really put their money where their mouths are, or at least their priorities in terms of economic recovery plans. The UK will host COP26, which we hope will be a significant opportunity to convene and drive some significant policy commitments. But I think it will be really, really important to link the value of energy resourcefulness and COVID-19 recovery. They can't be seen as two separate debates. In fact, one enables the other.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, almost getting to the close here, I just had a comment in from Peter Crowhurst in Myanmar that the country is tendering for solar at the moment, with the chamber supporting at least 2 UK companies, which is very good to hear. And Peter also, which is probably a good place to sort of wrap up, sent in another question, which I think speaks very much to the idea of collaboration. I mean, we've got people on this webinar from multiple countries across ASEAN. And Peter's, I won't read the full question, but he's essentially making the observation that there've been perhaps not as much joined up thinking and action around the chambers and around different initiatives as there could have been in the past. We've talked more about a little bit about how much more we've been brought together during this time. And he asks this, I mean, is this the time to develop a really coordinated and cost-effective Department of International Trade ASEAN marketing plan targeting towards the UK that presents the opportunities to exporters considering ASEAN as an export location? And it would be good perhaps to wrap up with some views from you, Natalie, on that point.
Thanks, Mark. And hi, Peter. Hope all is well in Yangon. Of course, I absolutely agree with you. It's really important that we have a strong UK-ASEAN pitch. Yes, on the marketing side, we know that that does make a difference. But of course, we want that to be in the fundamentals. As you know, I'm a big fan and big supporters of all the chambers across the region. And what we've been trying to do over a difficult few months for everyone is make sure that that relationship is stronger than ever, and using DIT ministers, for example, to really engage directly with all of your members to make sure that you're hearing everything firsthand, all the way through to consolidating advice and making sure that we're signposting everything that you do. The question, of course, is going forward, what's the best model to deliver for UK business in this part of the world? And I'm genuinely open to all ideas. You know, as Mark says, there's been various different iterations, and what we need to do is continually adapt and learn, but what can be a pretty challenging economic environment. So I hope that we can have some more discussions on this.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers for your time and for sharing your wonderful insights today on not only the state of the world, but also some sort of positives about what's being done to help us all navigate through it. That brings us to a close of the session today. I think the Chamber would like to highlight some of the other events that are due to be coming up shortly. Just to name a few, there is a sustainable business event, Kickstarting a Decade of Action on the 18th of June, Introduction to Digital Forensics on the 24th of June, Climate Change and Financial Risk on the 30th of June. And of course, the 21st Annual Business Awards are taking place. They've been postponed until the 29th of October, and entries are now extended until the 14th of August. So all being well, that will be a fantastic evening. You will receive a feedback form. Please fill that in. It will help the Chamber and us understand what you'd like to hear more of and how you felt today's session went. But I think it's all that's left to say is thank you very much, and we do hope that you'll be able to join us again in the future. So thank you, and have a good day.